Hello, y'all. Welcome to this week's 10-Minute 2-Tip Tuesday. I'm your host, Amelia Borland, occupational therapist and owner and founder of Higher Standards Caregiver Training. And as usual today, I'm going to give you two super valuable tips in only 10 minutes, maybe even less. I don't know. We're going to be quick today. We're going to be quick because I'm on a bit of a time crunch, but still want to make sure that you guys get this good and valuable information. So first tip is going to be for caregivers. And the second tip is going to be for caregiving organizations. And before we get started, please make sure to remember that this is for educational purposes only. If I say anything that reminds you of someone you care for, someone you work with, a loved one, anything like that, and you think that that person needs to be seen or treated by a licensed healthcare provider, then please make sure you're advocating for that person to get that appropriate treatment, as this is really and truly for educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for a therapeutic relationship or for health or medical advice. Okay, first tip for today for caregivers. So this is a question that I get asked about a lot. It's something that I've run into a ton in clinical practice working with folks who have dementia, and it's a big concern, like a really big concern. It's a concern for family members. It's a concern for caregivers. It is a concern for healthcare providers, like you name it. Everyone is worried when this happens. And the thing that can happen is that's very common is folks with dementia a lot of times will at a certain point they'll stop eating, right? And don't get me wrong, I should really preface this with the fact that there can be so many reasons why someone may not eat. But a lot of times when someone has dementia, it can be sort of like mysterious. Why isn't this person eating? You know, they had a good appetite. They seemed like they were hungry, and then they just kind of stopped and they start losing weight. And again, I will say there are so many reasons that someone might have stopped eating, or they may be losing weight. And so if that's something that you're seeing, it really, really warrants a call to the healthcare provider for that person. That said, sometimes when folks with dementia stop eating, it can simply be because the food that's in front of them has become overwhelming, and they have kind of progressed to a point where they've lost either the processing skills or the motor planning skills to figure out how to actually eat that food. So instead of picking up the food that's in front of them and eating it, they'll kind of just sit there and poke around at it, kind of mix it around, or they'll sit there and they won't really do anything at all. So one of the things that you can do to help people with dementia to eat better and feed themselves more, because we always want people to feed themselves as much as we can get them to. One of the things that you can do is to reduce the number of items that are in front of them at a given time. Simplify that situation. You know, if you give someone with dementia a plate that is loaded with food, that maybe it's only got 3 things on it, but that plate is full of stuff. Or you might have a plate that has, 4 or 5 things on it. Think you might have, think your Thanksgiving meal, not that we're all eating Thanksgiving every day, but you might have a protein, a starch, you might have a vegetable. There might also be like a salad along with it. Perhaps you presented them with dessert at the same time, and maybe there's also a roll, and there's a drink involved too. So very quickly, this can become an overwhelming amount of sort of food information for someone to process. And one of the things that you can do to help them to be able to start kind of engaging with the food and feeding themselves again is to reduce the number of things that they are having to process, to simplify that food, that eating situation. So, maybe you still want to encourage them to eat all 5 options that they have there, or, all 3 courses of that meal. But we want to make sure that we're only presenting as many things as that person can actually process and sort of manage and motor plan for at a given time. And it is it can be honestly, like, it can feel magical sometimes how simple it can be to simply say, okay, well, this plate looks really overwhelming. It's too much for this person to handle. They can't figure out how to actually start eating this food. It's too much. And by the way, we've probably all been in situations in restaurants where, like, they'll hand us something and we're like, oh, I don't even know where to start. It's kind of like that, right? So it can be almost magical sometimes when you take a plate of food that someone is looking at, they're kind of just poking around or they're not really eating it, and you simplify that plate of food so everything is, so it's easy to see, it's easy to process. Maybe there's only one or two things at a time there, and then suddenly they can start to begin to eat. Again, this is definitely something, if you know someone, if you're working with someone, if you care for someone who is not feeding themselves, who is losing weight, this is something that really needs to be discussed with the healthcare provider for that person. But thinking about how food is presented to someone and whether or not they can cognitively and physically manage that food is an important piece of the puzzle. Okay, so that was tip number 1 for caregivers. Tip number 2 for caregiving organizations. So one of the biggest reasons that I'll often run into where business owners maybe are having a lot of trouble with caregiver training or caregiver training programs, or maybe they've tried a couple of things and they're just really not interested in investing in another training program or trying something new, is because they've had an experience where their caregivers, they maybe purchased a training program, or they set up a training, or they did something for their caregivers to help train their caregivers, and what they found was that the caregivers didn't use it. And so there can be a lot of frustration saying, well, why am I trying to provide all this training if my caregivers are not engaging with that training? And of course, that is a super fair point. And I am getting to the hint, I promise, or I am getting to the tip for today, I promise. So on the flip side of that, what my experience has been and what I've found is that the vast majority of caregivers really are interested in learning. They're interested in education. They want to do the things that are required of them. So where is this disconnect coming through? And part of a higher standards caregiver training has really been figuring out, what is this process? What's the secret sauce to get people to actually engage with training, to take their training, to enjoy their training? And so that's something that we've really worked to pare down and really figure out what that secret sauce is. And of course, what we found is that it's not necessarily so secret. So I'm going to give you, so your tip for today for caregiving organizations is a really important part of that secret sauce for getting caregivers engaged in training. And that is, for you, the owner of the business, the leader of the organization, whatever it is, to have consistency in the way that you are communicating about that training to each and every one of your caregivers. Now, I realize that can seem like an overwhelming task in and of itself, but there are easy things that can be done in order to achieve that level of consistency that also helps to lead to a high level of engagement in training, and not just going to complete required trainings, but going back and getting more education and caregivers continually developing themselves. So, but that consistency, that part of it is so important. It's part of the not so secret sauce, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, all right, so that's it for me for today's 10-minute 2-tip Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, etc., about anything that you heard here today, if you have any questions for me, if you want to know more about higher standards caregiver training, or if there's just a topic that you want to know more about that you would love me to address in 10-minute 2-tip Tuesday, then please feel free to leave that in the comments or reach out. Otherwise, I'm all done for today. So I will see you next Tuesday for 10-Minute Two-Tip Tuesday. Until then, y'all, please stay healthy, stay well, and most of all, take care. Bye, y'all.